It is good for us to be together. I must say, this morning during class, we were studying about the temptation of Jesus. And it was about that time that I began to get the whiff of the donuts that Danny brought in today that are now in the fellowship hall. So, if you like donuts and you want to yield to the temptation of some chocolate donuts or whatever else he's gathered back there, please go back and partake of them, because if you don't, I'm afraid that my weakness is going to overcome me, and I will be back there as well. So thank you, Danny, for that. A few weeks ago, I stopped by Albertsons on the way home to pick up something for the dog, as a matter of fact. And as I was waiting in line to pay for the chicken strips that I got for her, I noticed there were a couple of ladies ahead of me that were talking back and forth, and they were strangers. They hadn't met or known each other before this line at Albertsons. And they were talking, and I heard them talking about this horrific plane crash that took place, of course, in Washington, D.C., where 67 people were killed. As they were talking about it and trying to make sense of it all, as one of the ladies began to pay for her groceries, she turned to the other woman and said, "Well, I guess everything happens for a reason." And that got me to thinking about that phrase, because unfortunately, it's one that we use ourselves from time to time, because there is an element of truth in it. It is sort of true that everything does happen for a reason. But I don't think we really understand what that means. And so I wanted to take some time this morning to go through that, because we're involved in our lives with tragedies that happen. And sometimes if they're of personal nature, and we're seeing someone, or we want to comfort someone that has going through this kind of thing, we have a tendency to say something because we feel it's necessary for us to say something, when in fact it would be better if we just didn't say anything at all and just told them we loved them. But you see, we try to make sense of everything that happens in life. We think that our brains that God has given us, that somehow if we really look at what happened and the individuals that were involved, that we could in fact make sense of it. But can we really? Has anyone ever said to you, "Well, it must have been God's will," or "everything happens for a reason"? And perhaps you even said it yourself. And I think what it comes down to is this particular passage that we read in Romans 8:28. You see, when you hear someone say everything happens for a reason, is it typically said after something good happens? Or do we say it after something bad happens? For example, if you told someone, "I just got a raise today and I'm really excited about it," you think they would turn to you and say, "Well, everything happens for a reason"? Or if you lost your job, would they say that same thing? "Well, everything happens for a reason"? Of course, we use that phrase when something bad happens. But I think basically when Christians say that, what they mean to say is God has a plan. And if you wait long enough, you will understand what that plan is and why this particular event happened. If you just give it enough time, you will see the good in it. But is that really true? And then we hear other variations to this. So it's meant to be, "Well, it must have been their time." Well, it must have been the time of the 67 people that died in that helicopter plane crash. It just must have been their time. Is that true? Is that really why it took place? Is everything that happens in this world something that God plans and wants to happen? I think in that question we come down to the subject of divine providence. Is God in control of everything. When we see the passage as we read, Romans 8:28, and we know that all things work together for good to those who love God and are called according to his purpose, do we understand that this passage doesn't apply to much of the population? We know that people believe that everything that happens is going to be good at some point in time, but is it really? And does that apply to everybody? Because we forget the part that says, to those who love the Lord and are called according to his purpose. So you've got to be part of the children of God in order for this to apply. It's only applicable to those who love God and follow Christ. So that brings us to the question of divine providence. What is it? Divine providence is simply God's looking over his creation. How involved is he in that creation? How to extent is he involved in the continuous activity of the world? What is God doing during the week when we're out there working? Is he really looking over things? Is he involved in things? Or does he just sit back and kind of let things happen? Well, that's one of the beliefs that people have in God and his relationship with us. That God has nothing to do with anything that happens. There are many that believe that God simply is there, but the world is in effect operating independent of God. Again, God is just sitting back, letting it happen. It's whatever will be, will be. It's kind of the que sera, sera, fatalistic point of view. That it just happens. We see that sometimes in sporting events, for example, when a team has not played well, they've lost maybe a close game, and one of the players is interviewed, and the player simply says, well, you know, we played our best, we lost, but I guess it just wasn't in the cards for us to win. It just wasn't in the cards. Rather than taking personal responsibility for the loss, saying, you know, today when we played, we stank. We weren't any good. We couldn't hit the broadside of a barn with the basketball. That's why we lost. The world is operating independent of God. It's on its own. Is that really what's happening? I don't think Christians believe that way because we know the Bible speaks differently to that. Here are some passages, and you'll find them again in the outline that we have in your bulletin. Psalms 147 and verse 4, God counts the stars and calls them all by name. So God created the universe. He tends to the galaxy. He knows exactly what's going on up in the universe. Matthew chapter 10 and verse 30, and even the very hairs of your head were all numbered. God knows something about us that we don't know. We don't know how many hairs we have on our head. Our parents didn't know how many hairs we have on our head. Our spouses don't know how many hairs on we had, but God does. God knows us that well. He knows us that intimately. And then we see the discourse between God and Job toward the end of the book of Job. And God is here explaining to God or reminding Job how he is sovereign over all things. And he simply says this in Job 39, beginning in verse 1. Do you know when the mountain goats give birth? Do you watch when the doe bears her fawn? Do you count the months till they bear? Do you know the time they give birth? God doesn't even miss an animal giving birth high up on a mountain. He knows and is familiar with all things that go on. God is involved in this world, and he doesn't miss a thing. Paul said in Acts 17 and verse 28, for in him we live and we move and we have our being. And some of your own poets have said this, we are his offspring. Without God, we wouldn't even exist. So, some people feel and believe that God has nothing to do with anything that happens. But as God's people, we know that's not true. The second belief or opinion is just the opposite. God has everything to do with everything that happens in the world, that God is in fact micromanaging everything that's going on in the world. This was John Calvin's belief, that not a raindrop falls from the sky, or not a whisk of the wind blows without God's special command. In other words, God commands everything to happen, and nothing happens without God commanding it. The same thing with whether you choose to follow Christ or not. It's not up to you. It's already been predetermined. Everything that happens in life has already been predetermined, and there's nothing you can do about it. Is God behind everything that happens as bad news? Is he the cause of everything that happens as bad news? I've told this story before, but it's applicable, I think, to our lesson this morning. In 2010, there were two former classmates at St. Joseph High School in Santa Maria that were back from college, a summer vacation, and they both had gotten jobs, and they were up riding on Telegraph Road, which is runs above 101. He was on his mountain bike. She was in her truck. Something happened when she was driving with her phone. She was distracted. She ran in the back of this classmate on his bike. Didn't even hit the brakes, never even saw him. And Eric Bokelblum was killed. And in that brief moment, the lives of two families were changed forever. Was that predetermined to happen? Did God have something to do with that? If you get cancer, if you get some debilitating disease, is that because God caused it to happen? Is that what we're to believe? And some people do, and it drives them away from God. How could he possibly be that kind of a God that would cause this kind of thing to happen? Why is he doing that to me? We have to remember that God created mankind with free will. We have free will. He's chosen to be involved in our lives, but he limits his involvement so that we can exercise that free will that he's blessed us with. Now think about it. We do the same thing with our children. We give them the free will to make certain choices in their lives. Some of their choices are good. Some of their choices are not so good. But what we hope for is that they will learn lessons about life in both kinds of choices that they make. It's the same way with God and us. In the free will that he's given us, we make choices in our lives too. Some are good, some are not as good. But his hope is that we, in fact, will learn from those choices more of life's lessons in accordance with what he wants us to do and the way he wants us to live. Just a few days before his death at age 110, Joshua was talking to the nation of Israel. And in Joshua chapter 24, beginning in verse 14, we see these words recorded. Now fear the Lord and serve him with all faithfulness. Throw away the gods your ancestors worshipped beyond the Euphrates River and in Egypt, and serve the Lord. But if serving the Lord seems undesirable to you, then choose for yourselves this day whom you will serve, whether the gods your ancestors served beyond the Euphrates, or the gods of the Amorites in whose land you are living. But as for me and my household, we will serve the Lord. If God had already predetermined what was going to happen in the life of the Israelites, why would he instruct Joshua to instruct them to make a choice? You see, we are free will people. We make our own choices. So, God has nothing to do with anything that's done in the world, or God has everything to do with everything that happens in the world. But then there's a third belief, that God has something to do with everything that happens. God has something to do with everything that happens in the world. He's created us with the ability to choose. And sometimes he prompts us through his word or our prayers on what the correct choice will be. But ultimately, we make that choice ourselves. I know many of you have sports watches. I have an Apple Watch. And they're great things. I mean, they're computers and their phones and their cameras, and they do all kinds of things for us. But one of the things they do is they keep track of our heart rates. They keep track of how well we exercise. And depending on how you have your watch set, it will remind you of certain times that you should be getting up off the couch, off the chair, and walk, do something. And it will typically remind you of that by either vibration on your watch, on your wrist, or a ding, a bell, whatever you've chosen. So when your watch goes off and it says, Roy, it's time for you to get up and walk, I have a choice. I can either get up and walk, or I can simply hit the dismiss button on the watch and go about my business. It's the same way with God. He prompts us to do certain things through his word. We have a choice then. We can either do them, or we can simply dismiss them and go on about our business and do whatever it is that we want to do. He's in control of his universe. And everything that happens, God knows that it happens, but that doesn't mean that he causes everything that happens. His sovereign control simply means that in the end, the will of God will prevail. The will of God will prevail. There are two ways that God is involved in everything that happens in our world, and the first is this: God's purposive will. In other words, that God causes things to happen. For example, we know Genesis 1:1 tells us about creation. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. God created. He did something. If he didn't do something, it wouldn't have happened. So God caused that to happen. In John 3:16, we know that for God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son. He sent Jesus into the world. It was his purposive will. He caused it to happen. And then we read in Revelation chapter 4, beginning of verse 11, the writer said, "You are worthy, O Lord our God, to receive glory and honor and power, for you created all things, and by your will they were created, and they have their being." So we see again, God's purposive will caused things to happen, created the world, and sent his Son to earth. The second thing that we see is God's permissive will. God permits things to happen. There are things that happen that are not caused by God. There are things that happen that he may not even want them to happen. But he allows them, he permits them to happen. So everything that happens in the world, either God caused it to happen or he permitted it to happen. Matthew chapter 23 and verse 37 is a reminder of that. God chooses us to allow it to choose him or not to choose him. Jesus said, "Jerusalem, Jerusalem, you who kill the prophets and those who sent you, how often I have longed to gather your children together as a hen gathers her chicks under her wings, and you were not willing." God wanted them to come to him, but they weren't willing to do that. And we know that God does not approve of everything that happens. Proverbs 6 and verse 17 reminds us that God hates hands that shed innocent blood. And in Malachi chapter 2 and verse 16, we're told that God hates divorce. Do these things happen in the world? Yes, they do. All we have to do is look around us. All we have to do is look at human nature. All we have to do is look at the news. And we see these things happening all the time. Does God cause them to happen? No, he does not. But his permissive will allows them to happen because he has given us the freedom to choose. God didn't cause Eve to eat the forbidden fruit. God did not cause Cain to kill Abel. God did not cause David to sleep with Bathsheba, but he allowed it to happen. We can look at it this way. There are things that cause everything to happen. There are some things that cause everything to happen. Three things. Number one, God. God causes things to happen. He is the supreme sovereign ruler of heaven and earth. And some things happen because he chooses them to happen. The second thing that causes everything to happen is free will beings. That's us. Humans' free will and Satan's influence on humans' free will can cause things to happen. We read about it in class this morning, some of the observations in Scripture about Satan and what he is out there doing. Proverbs 19 and verse 3, a person's own folly leads to their ruin, yet their heart rages against the Lord. God does not turn everything around and fix bad things in our life. He reminds us in Scripture many times that what you sow, so shall you reap. You reap what you sow. We know that's true. We look at our own lives and we see that happening. But sometimes bad things happen because of our bad choices, and sometimes bad things happen to us because we are intermingled with other human beings who make bad choices. And if we're looking for a reason for what happened with that horrific crash in Washington, D.C., I think that's where we're going to find it. That bad things can happen because our lives are intermingled with people who make bad choices. And that's a fact. We are simply involved in the backwash of all that. And there's a third thing. There's a third thing that causes everything to happen. And that's God's natural laws that he's put into place. Hurricanes, tornadoes, floods, earthquakes, deformities, diseases. Everything that happens in this world is probably related to one of these three things. Either God did it, free will beings did it, or God's natural laws caused them to happen. And God has the ability to intervene in any one of these events that happen in people's lives. And sometimes God does. I don't know if this has ever happened to you, but it's happened to me in all my travels between the Bay Area and here. When you're involved in so much driving on the highways and byways, you see accidents all around you. And there were times when I missed being involved in an accident by just a split second. Was that my luck? Or was that God's intervention? We do not know. We can't possibly know how many times God intervenes in our lives to save us from something that could have happened that we don't even realize. God is out there. God is involved in our lives. But we have such a limited perspective on things that we need to be careful on interpreting why things happen. Because God's ways are far beyond our ways. Our perspective is too small. Isaiah 55, beginning in verse 8, "For my thoughts are not your thoughts, neither are your ways my ways, declares the Lord. As the heavens are higher than the earth, so my way is higher than your ways, and my thoughts higher than your thoughts." think about this. Our sun is about 93 million miles away from us, and it travels at the light speed of about 186 miles per second. And what this simply means is, as you walk out the door this morning into the sunlight, and as you look at the sun, you're looking at something that happened 8 minutes ago. So as you look at the sun, you're really looking into past history. And also, the closest stars to the Earth are 4.37 light miles away. That's trillions of miles away from Earth. Yet God knows them. God sees them. He said, as heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thought higher than your thoughts. All things work together for good for those who love the Lord and are called according to his purpose. And I want us this morning to remember two words in that. And those two words are simply all things. All things, the good things, the mundane, normal things of life, and the bad things of life. God is there through all of them. Nothing is beyond God's source, his scope of providence. He can take any event, even if he didn't purpose it, and he can cause it to happen for good in our life. We may not see that good to come about now. It may be after we leave this place, but there'll come a time when he's promised us that it will somehow come into view, and we can see it in the end. When there are no more tears, no more sorrows, no more injustice, no more disease, no more pain or suffering, when God shall wipe away every tear. And what a beautiful time that will be. So I want us this morning to think about how blessed we are to have a God that knows us that well, that loves us so much that he gives us the freedom to choose how we want to live our life, and reminds us over and over the way he wants us to live our life. And the fact that we were created not to live here forever, but to live with him forever. And how we live here determines how we are going to live